Hello and welcome to part 2 of my scrutinization or scrutiny of Analytic Idealism, a consciousness-only ontology, a book by Bernardo Kastrup. And last time I dealt a bit with the, in a nutshell, description, or maybe an abstract, you could say, about what this attempts to do, he attempts to do in this book. And rather than doing a full deconstruction of the whole book, which is not something I actually desire too much, right? And I wouldn't also not want to have his government goons knock at my door and threaten me into submission because he might not like that I actually criticize his book, right? So I'm doing it in this alternative fashion, which is taking the description on what it tries to do and then finding out how the terms he uses to describe what he does, how he defines these terms in order to get to some kind of ontology, right? Understanding of what is foundational, and if there's something that is preordained or actually taken for granted in order to establish an ontology, because then I can just say, well, then I don't buy your ontology because I apparently have to have a proto-ontology in order to establish an ontology, right? And another thing is, if you're trying to define something in your ontology, I have realized myself that an ontology cannot be defined because definitions are themselves references to an ontology. When you're defining something, a planet is that which, then you are referring to some constituents you are defining that term as, or responsible for that term you're trying to define. Well, then that's a reference back to an ontology. The ontology is that scaffolding structure that directly images or is a philosophical representation of how your experiences or your phenomena work. Because the phenomena is that which you are actually describing when you're saying planet, for instance, right? So if I say planet, I can't define it as such, other than saying, well, according to the ontology, which I spent years constructing so that it seems to be without flaws and without holes and whatever, right? In my ontology, a planet is that which, whatever, right? So if you're trying to establish the ontology then, right? You can't use definitions because you need an ontology in order to make definitions, right? So if Bernardo Kastrup is coming up with a huge amount of definitions, he's actually appealing to a prior ontology that is going to be used to establish his ontology. Again, it's circularity, right? And that's another thing I've come to realize, which is the closer you get to the starting point of your philosophy, it gets more and more difficult to avoid circularity. Because you're going to maybe bring in something you have actually set aside in order to get to that foundation. You can't just keep it in your backpack and then bring them in when you want or need them because you have no other choice in your argumentative structure. No, that doesn't work, because that which you're trying to reduce yourself down to in your ontology or in your reduction exercise is exactly that which you're going to use to establish the ontology that sort of, quote, defines the rest that you left behind when you did the reduction, right? So actually, it doesn't really take much to discard this philosophy. There might be some aspects that are useful and provocative and you may add some spice to your own ontology if you have one, right? But you can't take this argumentation for granted, because defining something in ontology is saying, I'm going to use my ontology to establish my ontology. Doesn't work, right? Okay. So it is a difficult task to get without screwing up your philosophy, how you get to things in your ontology. It's very difficult, or unless you keep being strict about yourself and your thinking, it's likely that you're going to make some circular reasoning in order to establish ontology. So this will be a reminder to you. The deeper you get into the closer you get to a reduction base, the more likely it is that you're going to come up with some circularity in your argumentation. Just be aware of it, right? And as I said, appealing to definitions in an ontology is the same as saying, I have an ontology already. I'm going to use that to establish my ontology. Standing in your bucket and lift yourself up cannot be done, right? Okay, but let's take a look at it anyway. Sort of dissect the arguments and the thinking and so on here, right? And what I did was taking out of this, it is this quote from the beginning of the book that I've sort of placed in a more structured manner, that where you can see the structure of the argument, and the various terms used. And I've made a short list of the terms down here: ontology, analytic idealism, phenomena, consciousness, category, nature, and so on. There are more than that, but these are sort of the big ones, so to say, right? And out of these, I took 5 terms, including definition. 4 or 5 terms, I don't remember, but sufficient. If these doesn't really come across to me as definitions for the terms used, right, then I just sort of got a notion that maybe I'm overdoing it a bit. I don't know. Because what is in a nutshell presentation here is not the actual argument, or is not the actual reduction he does. So I'll have to deduce that this is a representation of his philosophy, his ontology as such, right? That ultimately it posits, as it says, a reduction base consisting of a single element, spatially unbound universal phenomenal consciousness, right? I might get back to that at some point, or hopefully, and if I don't get back to it, please remind me, right, that I need to get back to this formulation here, called a reduction, as I've written there, a reduction base consisting of a single element, spatially unbound universal phenomenal consciousness. I need to get back to that at some point and comment a few things on that. But I searched through the text for these particular terms, and if I search through the whole text, and wherever these terms are mentioned, it doesn't really make perfect sense to me, I am sort of skeptical about how he argues for whatever ends up being this, spatially unbound universal phenomenal consciousness, right? Because that's what he ultimately says he's going to prove to me. This is what it is, right? Okay, so I went through the term definition in the book, and I found this definition of mind, and mind is to be understood as the sense of phenomenal consciousness, or in the sense, phenomenal mind should be understood as phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so then he has a definition down here. It necessarily entails only the presence of phenomenal properties, in that it is defined as the substrate or ground of experience. So experience is grounded. Phenomenal consciousness is supposed to be understood as the ground for experience. So experience is sort of metaphorically floating around, or is just an aspect of phenomenal consciousness. Well, experiences are phenomena, right? Or at least some phenomena could be called experiences. So it already here starts to, it's this your shell game of using terms, and one term is defined by another term that is defined by a third term, and it's you very quickly get to camouflage potential circular reasoning because understandings of semantics of various terms are overlapping in a way that sort of camouflages that there might be some circularity going on here, right? Okay. The next one is then the rigorous definition of consciousness. What it means that it's conscious. Mental activity is conscious if it's something, anything that is like to have such mental activity of mind. That's where I said, yeah, I don't care about these Thomas Nagel and Chalmers and so on, that what they're doing in definitions is not defining things, because they need to have an ontology before they can define. If you don't have an ontology already, you can't define, right? And if you're attempting to present a definition, you're merely just rephrasing what you're talking about, and that rephrasing is going to add a whole bunch of new terms into the thing, right? So that is what is the problem in general in academic philosophy, in my opinion, that because they are not approaching a reduction in a rigid manner, they are rephrasing terms, pretending to define it, but they can't define it because they don't have that ontology. And then they get lost in all these terms, right? Because in this case, for instance, consciousness all of a sudden explodes into a set of terms. Mental activity is conscious if and only if there's something it is like to have that mental activity in and of itself, right? But then if you have some likeness, then it is backward. You are bringing in the terms before you have that activity that is supposed to be aware of in order to have the ontology that clarifies that activity. And it is this circularity. It's everywhere in these philosophies, right? It is one big pile of circularity. And if you sit and read through this and you basically just feel more confused than when you started reading, this might be the reason why. It is not structured. It is not rigid. It is throwing words at you until you throw in the towel and say, I guess the fancy academics are right because, whatever, right? The other ones where I searched for definition didn't really bring much to the table that I found to be other than references to definition, not actual definitions, right? So that's it. Maybe I should get back to this one while I'm at it and while I remember it, right? It posits this dissertation. So this is fairly clear at least, right? A reduction base consisting of a single element. Okay. A reduction base is not an ontology. That's just the starting point for the ontology, right? But he calls the book a consciousness-only ontology. So why is he talking about this book is going to give you a reduction base? Shouldn't it say, I'm going to give you an ontology? Because the reduction base is only the starting point, isn't it? It's just kind of strange, right? And it must be because he said, well, I have reduced everything to one thing. And if there's only one thing, everything is that. So the whole, apparently, the rest of the ontology just pops out of the idea that I have a reduction base that is only one single element. That's a bit of a leap, right? If that's what he's trying to do. Otherwise, it's very, very, very misguided, this, right? So he promises you an ontology, but what he says he's going to do is just giving you a reduction base, right? So it's supposed to be understood as if, yes, because I came up with this particular reduction base, all of a sudden, there should be an ontology popping out of this. Or is this a nutshell presentation not really what he's actually doing? Maybe the whole picture is that he's doing an ontology. I haven't read the book, right? Or the paper, or whatever it is, book, right? It's very strange. And another thing you might be concerned about, right? It is, if a reduction base is a single element, why does he need to have 5 different words to describe it? Right? That are huge terms, right? Space, unbound, universal, phenomena, and consciousness, right? Because if that's a reduction base that is a single element, why is he using 5 different terms? It doesn't feel like it's very simple and one single element, right? It feels like that I'm not, it's so fluffy for me, so I have to add a lot of terms to it to make sure that you don't misunderstand what I'm doing, right? And furthermore, each of these 5 terms needs a definition, right? How do I get to that definition? Don't you need an ontology in order to give me a definition? Right? What are you basing definitions on if you don't have an ontology or you don't have a reduction base? How are you reducing? Right? And you're reducing into 5 terms. It's ridiculous, man, right? Each of these 5 terms need a definition. Well, then if each of these terms need 5 words to define them, then we are all of a sudden up at 25 terms, right? And if these terms need definition, you can, it's an exponential growth in terms, right? And it's just complete garbage, right? Doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's mental masturbation, right? It is abstract circle jerk of your own mind, thinking that you'll come up with some shit, right? I'm not buying it. Okay, the next term I searched for is analytic and analytic idealism. Am I actually not sure if I search for analytic idealism or analytic? But I think these 2 terms are usually mentioned together, so let's take it from there, right? Okay, analytic idealism. This is on page 11. This is a strictly analytic, conceptually clear articulation of idealism. Okay, so he's telling you it is conceptually clear, right? And it's strictly, he's telling you what you should think. You can't extract this by your own standard, right? So it's great philosophy, he basically says, right? This is really good philosophy because I did it, right? And I have 2 PhDs. Okay, on page 12, discusses what is perhaps the root of key unresolved problems in contemporary analytic philosophy. Okay, well, have fun, right? The tendency to try to make sense of nature by replacing concrete observation with theoretical abstractions. Well, isn't that what you're doing, right? Aren't these abstractions you're mentioning? I don't see any beavers or Eiffel Towers in that definition up here, right? Or that description up here. It is all made spatial, unbound, universal, phenomenal consciousness. These are all abstractions. I can't experience these things, right? I can't experience spatiality. Maybe if there's one thing I can experience, it's spatiality. But you could maybe argue that even space is an abstraction, right? But let's say that I'm experiencing space in the sense that I feel spatiality to my experience. Fine. Then that's the anchor point. That is the only potential relation to something that I can experience. Unbound, that's an abstraction that things are not bound, right? They extend to everywhere, basically, right? That's an abstraction. That's not an experience, right? Universal is an idea. It can be everywhere, right? But that you're not experiencing can be everywhere, right? It's an abstraction. Phenomenal, but that's a label maybe you put on a category of things, or the category of things you can experience are phenomena, right? Lacking a bit of term here maybe, right? But you're not experiencing phenomena, you're having experiences you classify as phenomena, right? So maybe there's something, yeah, okay, you could maybe discuss, you can experience phenomena, but you're not really, it would say that, it's the same as saying, because I'm experiencing elephant, I'm experiencing animal, right? You're not experiencing animal, you're experiencing elephant, and then somebody or you came up with the idea of the category of animal for whatever reason. But that doesn't mean all of a sudden you experience animal just because you have classified an elephant as an animal, right? In the same way, all these experiences I have, all these qualia and cognitions, and what stems from them, right? Just because I call them phenomena doesn't mean I'm all of a sudden experiencing phenomena, right? It's just be careful with the language. Consciousness is also an abstraction, right? To some extent. So I'm just trying to point out that this definition or statement helps me in no way, right? It is an attempt to very simple, parsimonious, and then slamming 5 words on top of it that hasn't been fully explained, right? So there's apparently something that is taken for granted in order to go do this for him, right? But you can't take anything for granted. You can't expect either yourself or your reader to have an ontology when you're describing your ontology, right? You can't say, I'm going to make the perfect ontology, because that is basically a solipsist approach. You are solipsist until you have established an ontology and clarified how you get to an external world. Then you can say, okay, now I can listen to somebody else's ontology, right? But if you're then talking to somebody else, apparently, you expect them to have that ontology already before you can tell them about your ontology. Otherwise, they're still solipsist, right? So why would they? I mean, it's just there are implicit arguments or shortcomings in the approach that is not stated in the text, but comes with the whole idea of what is being done, right? That's what I'm trying to get to. Okay, let's get back to the search. I think I discusses page 12 discusses what is perhaps the root key of the unresolved problems in contemporary analytic philosophy. The tendency, I just have to plug in my power supply. Excuse me. The tendency to try to make sense of nature by replacing concrete observation with theoretical abstractions. Okay, I had already done that one. Also, page 12, this dissertation elaborates on an analytic formulation of idealism. Okay, so why is this particularly good, right? It's not that, it doesn't explain to me what analytic idealism is, or analytic, right? Analytic idealism requires nothing more than phenomenality to offer a coherent categorical interpretation of nature. But again, but what is nature? Phenomenality. You are using phenomenality to describe nature, but then nature must be something different from phenomenality. So how can you use something that is different from what it is to describe something else and say you only need that to describe it? But then there's something else that you're describing using that phenomenality. Then there's something still missing. Because you're using a part of it to describe the rest, apparently. But that's not ontology. You're describing everything in an ontology. You're describing it. You're not explaining it. Right? I mean, if anything, the whole of the ontology is one explanation. I'm just careful about this explanation fetish. Because what usually comes up ending being is, I have this term, mind. Explain what is mind? Or another one, classic one, what is a soul, right? Well, who says there's a soul, right? Just because you have a word called soul doesn't mean that all of a sudden there must be an explanation. It's kind of sophist, right? So, okay, let's get back. Analytic idealism require. Okay, I've done that already. Also, page 13. This dissertation attempts to show that criticisms are often based on logical fallacies such as question begging, unexamined assumptions, misunderstandings of the implication of analytic idealism. Well, maybe he should point these criticism on his old philosophy, right? Logical fallacies like circularity, right? Well, or circularity, as he says, question begging, which is another term. It is the official term. Begging the question is a circular reasoning, right? Unexamined assumptions, well, like there must be an external world, for instance, right? Misunderstandings of the implications, etc. Okay, fair enough. Moreover, even if we were to look at the brain alone, ignoring the metabolism in the rest of the body, okay, so he's appealing to an already established, this is only page 14 out of, I think, 140 pages or something like that, right? So this is early in the game. So he's referring to metabolism as something that is settled, right? The rest of the body, he's taking a whole slew of things for granted, and he can use them to explain the whole thing before it becomes the thing. All right? He is a victim of all these fallacies that he is saying. He's sort of, the best defense is an attack, right? He's going to say, yeah, all the other people are doing a lot of fallacies, so look at their bad philosophy, and then come back to my perfect philosophy that doesn't really need to be scrutinized because I'm so perfect, right? So it sort of diverts the attention to the other ones who might have an even worse philosophy and say, hey, look how bad they are, right? Mine is better. Well, it's the difference between shitty and very shitty, right? Oh. Okay, page 14. Moreover, even if we were to look at the brain alone, ignoring the metabolism in the rest of the body, recent studies in psychology suggests, well, that you can't use recent studies in your ontology, right? Because you need your ontology to understand what you mean by recent studies, right? Man, fucking stupid asshole, man. Oh, man, it's stupid, right? Suggests the presence of seemingly unconscious mental processes in the brain. Oh, my God. This, if true, would already contradict analytic idealism. Okay. Well, you're in luck here, buddy. You can't use that to refute your ontology. You can't say, okay, I'm establishing my ontology. Oh, by the way, I'm going to do something that necessitates I've already done my ontology to try to criticize my ontology from some external world I haven't established from. It's this eighth dimensional mindfuck, right? Okay, enough of that. Page 14 also. Under analytic idealism, on the other hand, and this, he's also personally distancing himself from the philosophy. He's like, now analytic idealism is taking its own personal form. He's talking about it as if it exists outside himself. Under analytic idealism, it's no longer his philosophy. It has its own existence almost, right? He's not saying, how this is, in my thinking, this is right or this is wrong. No, he says, under analytic idealism, right? He's sort of distancing himself from it as if it's, so now it's settled and it's sitting there and it's talking to me and it's telling me, well, under my individual being of analytic idealism, I am telling you that under my philosophy, this is the. It doesn't. I like when people are saying, this is my philosophy, right? Because that's what it is. It is his thinking. It's not under analytic idealism as if it has been carved in marble and placed there as a a pyramid of a pure reasoning that is sort of established now, right? But it gets this air of authority this way, right? It is subconsciously sophist, I would say. Okay. Correlations between impaired brain function and enriched conscious inner life are to be expected if normal brain function is part of the extrinsic appearance of a dissociated alter of universal consciousness. Already here we have an alter, right? This is sort of, this dissociated, it's like, this dissociation thing I have seen when I've seen his presentations. Oftentimes, he just starts to talk about it as if it's given, right? Well, there are these dissociated alters then. Well, where did that come from, right? Well, a woman in Germany, if people ask, right? I mean, it's I don't have much respect left for his philosophy, to be quite honest, right? I pointed out at least 4 or 5 huge shortcomings in my recent series on my ontology, and I think it's part 6 or follow-up number 6. I don't remember exactly. Maybe it's part 7. It's called dualism, but most of the time in that particular part, I present shortcomings in idealism, and particular analytic idealism, because that's, the modern renaissance in metaphysics, right? Okay, let's see. Contrary to physicalism, analytic idealism can thus not only accommodate but also make sense of the evidence discussed in chapter 6. Okay, still no definition of what is meant by analytic or idealism, right? That's the main purpose of what I'm doing. So if he's not, describing or defining how we use these terms, it's then he takes things for granted, as I say, right? And if he takes things for granted, he must expect me to already have an ontology, right? And then it becomes a strange kind of circularity, right? Okay. It is entirely coherent within the logic of analytic idealism that a smaller alter could be more strongly dissociated from universal consciousness than a big alter, or the other way around. Whatever. This is why under analytic idealism, many or even most types of brain function impairment should still come accompanied by cognitive deficit, not awareness expansion. What distinguishes the predictions of analytic idealism from those of mainstream physicalism is this. under analytic idealism, some types of brain function impairments should in principle lead to enriched conscious inner life. But you can't say, I have come up with a philosophy that is going to tell me how my ontology is supposed to function. You can't do that, right? It's not sort of a magical tool that, that clarifies. You have to do the ontology and then say, this is what I call analytic idealism. It's not a magical tool to get there. You have to do the reduction and the ontology establishment, and then you can say, this is what I call analytic idealism. That's what I'm trying to figure out if you understand. So, and it's also very alarming, that this page 10, I'm on page 10, that this, as he calls it, it's an elaboration on a particular kind of approach to idealism, right? Or the ontology of idealism. It's just 140 pages or something like that of elaborations on an ontology. 140 fucking pages, man, right? It tells me everything about how much of a mindfuck this is. Nobody in their right mind would... I mean, if I stand down in the grocery store and I want to do something, could I possibly pull this up and sort of, hey, I have to check ripples? No. Is it a conscious awareness, the likeness of a bat that is sort of am I spatially unbound? And what? How does it work? Okay, I know that an ontology is the ground floor of your philosophy, but still, if this is 140 pages to elaborate on it, if you were to present a complete ontology, would it then be 250 pages or what, right? Then what about epistemology? What about, ethics and so on? Are we closing in on 1,000 pages or something like that, right? How would I approach that? Would it have to be condensed into a one-pager that I could keep in my back pocket in order to get around, or what? How does it work, right? Where is it leading? Where are we going with this, right? No, we are not really going anywhere, because he doesn't, in my opinion, he wants to take a left turn out of philosophy into metaphysics and stay there with his big mind daddy, because that makes him feel good, right? Metaphysics is a point where you might end up saying, I'm leaving the rest behind, knowledge and ethics, and I'm going into my cloud castle and staying there, right? That's the dangerousness of doing metaphysics. You might leave in your metaphysical balloon and cut the wire and never come back, right? And you might even end up crash and burn like a Hindenburg, right? And then, you're gone forever. So that's what I don't like about these metaphysical or these idealists usually, is that they seem to retract into mind abstractions and so on, and they stay there. They're never going to do epistemology, they're never going to do ethics. And they're possibly convinced that just because they came up with the idea of ripples, for instance, then everything is just going to pop out there, right? Now I know everything because I have come up with the idea that there are ripples behind everything, right? But, every day, I mean, when you buy tomatoes, right? It's still the same old shit you're doing, right? No matter how fancy that, metaphysics out there is, right? You're still buying the tomato, you're still, bringing it to your fridge and putting it there and eating it the next day and slicing it up or whatever, making a Greek salad or whatever, right? There's nothing that changes. I mean, tell me where it affects my everyday. At what point do we get to tomatoes, right? That's usually a question I start asking. Let me get back to page 10. Okay, I think I did the top one. Then the second one here, right? Page 16. If analytic idealism is true, what are its implications? In other words, how does it change the way we look upon life and the world? Now, this is interesting, right? First of all, when you're using the term true, you are appealing to a proposition. Now, anybody with any, thinking hat on and used to doing some decent philosophy will tell you the only things that can be true or false are propositions, right? If you propose something, then that proposition can be true or false. But what is very important to settle on, what can actually be a proposition, right? I would say that you can only propose knowledge, and only you can know what you know. So when you're making a proposition, you are stating what you believe to know, or what you have categorized as knowledge, I should say, right? So if I'm experiencing elephant eyes and I point and say, that's an elephant, I am proposing my knowledge, right? If I define, for instance, elephant as knowledge, let's say, right? Or my definition of knowledge entails that elephant is knowledge, classified as knowledge. So then when I make the proposition elephant, I am proposing my knowledge, right? Now, you can't propose analytic idealism, right? Because it's an fucking ontology. It's so fucking stupid. It's next level stupid, right? The stupidity of this is so huge that he possibly cannot see it, right? And there's also another thing is, and that's the first word in this sentence, right? If it is true, what are the implications? Well, first of all, it can't be true because you need knowledge in order to establish what you mean by, in order to make a proposition that can be true or false, right? So you need to do epistemology. In order to do epistemology, you need to have settled on ontology and metaphysics. But we're doing ontology here, right? So you can't claim any truth about this. It's a completely fucked up way of thinking. It goes against any decent standard, right? And you can't also say if it's true. Well, who's going to tell you if it's true or not? Because you're bringing it. You say it's an analytic idealism. Then you can't ask the question if it's true. Or let's say you actually mean that it's correct or valid or something like that. Well, then you need to establish that first before you start to use it. And the if, in my opinion, is not philosophy. There are no ifs in philosophy. There are no ifs. Ifs are only in science. When you do science, you can say, if this beaver and the Eiffel Tower and Earth is made of the same stuff, then this thing I have stated here, this theory and formula holds. If they're made of the same thing, what if they're all made of the same thing, which I'm going to call matter? If this is the case, and I'm stating this as a theory, then it will hold if it's correct. But you don't know if it's correct. It's only correct as long as you don't find something that contradicts it. That's science. You can't have an if in philosophy. I'm getting kind of agitated here, right? And I sometimes feel that maybe sometimes I get a little too carried away in my agitation, and you might, I'm trying to work a bit on it, right? Because it's not that I'm not necessarily, it's incorrect what I'm saying just because I get a little agitated, but it might not come across as if I'm on top of myself, right? And I don't want to sound like I'm a crazy idiot or something like that, right? But I think it comes from the passions, right? As Hume famously stated that reason ought and should only be I'm paraphrasing, the slave of the passions, right? And I understood in that way that it's because you have a passion that you do whatever you do, right? It's based on emotions and feelings and something like that encourages you to do whatever, right? And I'm sort of very passionate about these things because if somebody tells me, hey, this is the greatest new movement and it's the crusade of modern thinking and so on, hey, everybody's going to think this way in 20 years and you better believe it, and sort of, I'm like, okay, hang on, dudes, right? Let me take a scrutinized look at this. And when I find stupid shit like this, right, I'm like waving the red flags here, man. Hey, you might want to take a look at this bullshit you've written here, right? Okay. Analytic Idealism regards, okay, it's no longer him regarding it. It's his pyramid of analytic reasoning that stands over there and tells you that it regards the world as the extrinsic appearance of intrinsic universal phenomenal activity. Okay, so this is actually a definition that I haven't pointed out, right? The world. So now we have something called the world. The extrinsic appearance of intrinsic universal phenomenal activity. Well, if there's extrinsic and intrinsic, that goes against the idea of being universal. And then we get back to that idea of, there are various ripples, but they're basically all the same thing. It's the same ocean that ripples. It ripples a little over here and over there. And these ripples are just, extrinsic or intrinsic, whether or not you experience them or not. But they're basically all a part of the same universal phenomenal activity, right? It is again these abstract terms he is gluing together without any real clarification, in my opinion, right? What I'm starting to see a picture of is I'm going to make a scientific approach that says, if I take this idea that everything is mind, can I push away any argument against it? And if you can argue against it, it hasn't been refuted, which is a scientific approach, right? But philosophy is not science. Or science is not philosophy, maybe I should say, right? You can't do scientific approach to thinking in particular, right? It's glaring when you're doing ontology. You can't have a scientific approach to ontology because you need your ontology and a few other things like epistemology in order to do science, right? You can use these ifs. What if it's all mind? Let me see if I can find some reasoning against it. I can't, so you can't refute it, so I might as well go with it, right? No, that's not ontology. It's complete mindfuck, this, right? He basically doesn't understand what he's doing, I would say, right? It's the old materialist scientific approach to understanding the world. I'm creating a theory. I'm trying to find holes in it. If I can't find hole in it, I can still go and use it, right? Like gravity. There's no holes in it, so I can use it, right? But that's science. That's not philosophy, right? That's the major difference between science and philosophy. Science is when you try to second guess about what keeps you as the events in your experience together, right? Without having access to whatever it is going on, you're trying to create a story about it that is hopefully, maybe not hopefully, but this far hasn't been refuted yet, right? So you can go and use it in order to predict whatever you want in the future, right? That's not what you're doing when you're doing philosophy, in my opinion, right? Philosophy is when you say, this is what I've got to work with, right? And I've come up with this structure and these definitions of this, that, and these axioms and so on, in order to clarify how my mind works, so to say, right? And I don't want to use mind in this, but how my phenomena work, maybe I should say, right? Ontology is not explaining. Ontology is just categorizing and finding out if there are interdependencies between, for instance, qualia and cognitions, as I've done, right? I'm not explaining color. I'm not explaining elephant, right? So it's when you're looking at people doing potential ontology, be careful and look for if they're using the term if. They can't use the term if in an ontology. They're guessing their way to what they want to be there, right? Okay. The second question that naturally arises if one finds the, and mind you, these are all taken out of context, right? As you know, these are sentences or coupling of sentences where these particular terms are used, right? For analytical idealism compelling is this: what drove the formidable momentum behind the mainstream adoption of physicalism over the past 200 years or so, if a more plausible, available alternative, unaffected by fundamental problems, such as the hard problem of consciousness, has existed all along? Well, whatever. We still haven't got a definition of either analytic or idealism, as far as I can see, right? A claim made already in the title of chapter 3 is that according to analytic idealism, the universe is in consciousness. This is liable to misinterpretation insofar as analytic idealism entails that consciousness is the categorical basis, the underlying essence of all that exists. Now there's an essence, right? It's like, okay, now I'm going to bring in a new term. All of a sudden there's essence, right? Of all that exists, shouldn't one say instead that the universe is consciousness? This perceived universe is in consciousness according to analytic idealism. It consists of particular patterns of excitation of universal consciousness. Yeah, that's what you said in the beginning. Having made these upfront clarifications, I am now ready to begin elaborating on analytic idealism. But why you... But isn't the whole ontology... I mean, how do I understand the starting point of this then? Isn't the whole ontology supposed to be analytic idealism? Then you can elaborate on it in page 19, because I would think that the whole 140 pages is that which establishes this particular kind of ontology. That is what the title promises me, right? So you can start to elaborate on it on page 19, because analytic idealism is the ontology, isn't it? I just don't get it, man, right? It sounds more than confused, right? The first half of the paper comprises a detailed analysis of relevant literature, highlighting what advances have been made and what problems have been created or left unsolved by recent developments in analytic philosophy. Okay, so it's like, okay, we are developing this philosophy, and it must be a consensus agreement about the development. Okay, this is a new development. Everyone accepts this, right? This is an improvement of the philosophy. Everybody who, it's sort of an appeal to a consensus drive towards a perfectioning of a philosophy. Where is that consensus? Where is it? It's an appeal to something I believe don't exist. But it gives a notion of we are doing some great work here. We are good. There's progress here, right? Oh. Okay, the ontology of idealism, on the other hand, entails that all physical structures are circumcised. I was going to say circumcised. Circumscribed by consciousness in that they exist solely as phenomenality in the first place, unlike the other alternatives. However, idealism is often considered implausible today, particularly by analytic philosophers. Okay, that's interesting. Particularly by analytic philosophers don't like idealism, but he's going to. Okay, that doesn't rule. That's not in itself an argument. It's just strange. A reason for this is the strong intuition that an objective world transcending phenomenality is a self-evident fact. Oh, facts. Okay, you can bring in facts doing ontology, right? A fact is a reference to knowledge. That elephant I was talking about, I proposed before, using my knowledge elephant. Then whatever I'm stating in that proposition, the fact is elephant. Right? Knowledge is a specific category of my phenomena. And this particular phenomena is the fact I'm referring to in my proposition. Then the elephant is fact. Then objective world transcending phenomenality cannot be a fact because it's some kind of metaphysics, right? Metaphysics is a foundation for getting to facts. But then that can't be a fact, right? Okay, the last one here before I'll have to start on page 97 in the next part of this series, right? Idealism is a unique ontology in that, unlike physicalism and panpsychism, it asserts that physical structures are circumscribed by consciousness as opposed to the other way around. Yet analytic philosophy has traditionally considered idealism implausible. In this essay, I have argued that the alleged implausibility of idealism is based on misconceptions such as unfounded intuition, for instance, taking the concreteness of the world to indicate its independence from consciousness, or asserting the implausibility of universal inner life, a lack of philosophical imagination. Philosophy is not imagining shit, right? This is a Freudian slip, right? Philosophy is freaking not about imagining shit. Assuming that multiple private minds and a standalone world cannot be coherently reduced to a single universal consciousness. Well, why don't you present me with some of that reduction? How do you get to it? What is that procedure? That reduction procedure? Give it to me, right? You're giving me the result of a supposed reduction. Right? And maybe there is a reduction exercise done in the book that, somewhere. And maybe I should search for a reduction. Actually, I'm not sure if I did that search through the book, reduction, right? Or reduced. But we'll see later, right? There's a lot of things to handle here, right? But I have 1 minute left, so let me see if I can. It's sort of they can't understand this big thing I'm doing, right? And they're just kind of stupid probably because they don't have imagination. Well, you're not imagining your philosophy. If your philosophy is describing what is going on and making axioms and making definitions, right? Based on an ontology and a reduction base. Okay, that's all I have for you in this part. Please share, like, and subscribe. Give me a comment. Consider donation links below. And otherwise, have a nice day. See you in the next one.